When we talk about creating meaningful change in our lives, it's tempting to think we need to overhaul everything at once. Start a new diet, begin a strict workout regimen, meditate for an hour, journal nightly, read more, sleep more, cut out caffeine, cut out sugar. The list grows quickly, but the brain doesn't respond well to chaos or overload. It responds to consistency, repetition, and emotional relevance. This is a fundamental principle of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience. It's the reason why small, consistent habits have far more impact over time than intense, unsustainable efforts. In fact, when you try to change too much at once, you create internal resistance. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for executive function, can only hold a limited amount of information in working memory. Overload that system and it shuts down. You default back to old patterns, not because of weakness, but because of biological limits. Now, when a small behavior is repeated with focus and emotional engagement, something remarkable happens. Neural pathways involved in that behavior begin to fire more efficiently. Myelin, the fatty sheath that insulates nerve fibers, increases along these circuits, making them faster and more automatic. The behavior goes from being effortful and conscious to effortless and subconscious. That's how habits form, not because of desire, but because of physical changes in brain structure, but those changes only happen through repetition. Off efforts don't trigger plasticity. You have to send a signal often enough and with enough clarity for the nervous system to prioritize it. Repetition is key, but it's not enough by itself. You also need attention. The brain changes most when you're paying close attention to what you're doing. Mindless repetition doesn't work nearly as well. So when you deliberately focus on the habit you're practicing, even if it's just drinking a glass of water first thing in the morning or stepping outside to get sunlight, you amplify the brain's ability to encode that habit. Attention acts as a spotlight. It tells the nervous system, this is important, strengthen this. Emotional relevance is the third ingredient. When you care about the outcome, when there's an emotional charge associated with what you're doing, the brain tags the experience as meaningful. This boosts levels of neuromodulators like dopamine and acetylcholine, which heighten plasticity. So if you approach a habit not as a chore, but as a tool to change your state, your energy, your focus, your identity, you increase the likelihood that your brain will adapt. Dopamine, in particular, plays a massive role here. It's not just about pleasure. It's about motivation, drive, and the anticipation of reward. Each time you complete a small habit and associate it with progress, even just checking it off a list, you get a small dopamine release. Over time, this conditions the brain to crave that behavior, and that's where habits become self-reinforcing. One of the most powerful aspects of small habits is that they bypass the brain's threat detection system. When you attempt a huge behavioral change, the amygdala often interprets it as danger. The stress response activates, cortisol rises, and your body enters a state of resistance. But small habits, especially those that are simple and quick, fly under the radar. They don't provoke threat responses. They feel manageable, and because they're manageable, you're far more likely to repeat them. That repetition builds fluency. Fluency builds identity. Eventually, you stop trying to be the kind of person who does the habit. You just are. There's also a psychological mechanism at play called the aggregation of marginal gains. This is the principle that tiny improvements, compounded over time, yield massive results. In the brain, this works through synaptic strengthening. Each time you perform a habit, you slightly increase the efficiency of the neural circuit behind it. Even a 1% improvement each day leads to exponential growth over weeks and months. And what's fascinating is that these gains often cross domains. A morning light exposure habit, for instance, not only improves circadian alignment and sleep quality, it also enhances daytime energy and alertness, which makes it easier to focus, move, and make better food choices. One small habit creates ripple effects across multiple systems. This is why the duration of 21 days is so important. It's not just a motivational concept. It reflects the minimum time required to start shifting these neural pathways toward automation. In the first week, the habit feels new and awkward. The brain is using a lot of energy to encode the behavior. You're still relying heavily on willpower. By the second week, the circuits are starting to strengthen. You feel a bit more fluent, and the resistance drops. By the third week, the behavior begins to feel familiar. The brain requires less effort to perform it. At this point, you're transitioning from the effortful phase to the automatic phase. And if you keep going beyond 21 days, that neural circuit becomes more robust. The habit moves into procedural memory, your brain's storage for things you can do without thinking. One of the overlooked aspects of this process is the identity shift that comes with repeated action. Every time you complete a small habit, you're casting a vote for the type of person you believe yourself to be. Over time, these votes accumulate. You go from someone who's trying to be disciplined to someone who is disciplined. From someone who tries to be focused to someone who is focused. This is not magical thinking. It's neurobiological reinforcement. Your brain uses past behavior to predict future identity. So when your behaviors change, even in small ways, your self-perception follows. And that self-perception becomes a powerful driver of future behavior. You begin to act in alignment with who you believe you are. The real shift happens when the habit is no longer something you do. It's something that does you. It becomes embedded in your circuitry, and once it's there, it becomes a foundation for other behaviors. Success in one area builds confidence in others. This creates a positive feedback loop that propels you forward. All from small, consistent actions repeated daily. That's the biology of change. That's how you build a new brain. When it comes to lasting personal transformation, biology must be on your side. Willpower alone is unreliable. It fluctuates based on stress, sleep, nutrition, and emotional state. But when you align your daily behaviors with the systems that govern your brain and body, you gain leverage. You stop working against your biology and start working with it. That's the power of using biology-backed tools. These aren't abstract concepts or life hacks. They're rooted in neuroscience and physiology. They tap directly into the mechanisms that regulate energy, focus, mood, motivation, and adaptation. The brain and body are not passive. They respond actively to the inputs you give them. If you give them the right inputs, even in small doses, they begin to rewire and optimize themselves over time. Start with morning sunlight. This is not a preference. It's a biological necessity. Light is the strongest signal to the circadian system. The retina contains specialized cells, melanopsin-containing retinal ganglion cells, that respond specifically to bright light, particularly in the blue spectrum. When you expose your eyes to sunlight in the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking, these cells send signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus. This sets the master circadian clock, which then sends signals to every cell in your body. Cortisol rises in the early part of the day in response to this light exposure, promoting alertness, metabolism, and immune function. But if you delay this exposure or miss it entirely, your internal clock drifts, cortisol peaks at the wrong time, melatonin in production is suppressed at night, and sleep becomes fragmented. That misalignment affects everything: your cognitive clarity, your emotional regulation, your hormonal rhythm. A simple act like stepping outside and facing the morning sky for 5 to 10 minutes can literally anchor your 24-hour biological rhythm and improve every other system that follows. Cold exposure taps into a different but equally powerful mechanism, your autonomic nervous system. When you expose your body to cold, even for just a minute, you create a short-term stressor that drives up levels of norepinephrine and dopamine. These chemicals are not just about energy or feeling good. They regulate attention, drive, and mood stability. Dopamine, in particular, is involved in reward prediction and motivational salience. When you increase baseline dopamine through regular cold exposure, you don't just feel better, you become more capable of effort over time. Your threshold for discomfort increases, your willingness to take action improves. These aren't mindset shifts. They are measurable biochemical shifts in the brain's reward and arousal systems. Cold also improves vagal tone, the strength of the parasympathetic nervous system, by training the body to calm itself after stress. That means better heart rate variability, better emotional control, and faster recovery after mental or physical exertion. Physical movement is another tool with profound effects. Exercise isn't just about fitness. It's one of the most reliable ways to enhance brain function. When you move your body, especially in the first half of the day, you release brain-derived neurotrophic factor BDNF. This molecule supports the survival and growth of neurons and enhances synaptic plasticity, particularly in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, regions involved in learning, memory, and executive function. Low levels of BDNF are associated with depression, cognitive decline, and poor learning capacity. High levels are associated with improved memory, resilience, and mental clarity. And you don't need hours in the gym to trigger it. Just 10 to 20 minutes of elevated heart rate or moderate exertion is enough. Consistent daily movement, even in small doses, rewires the brain to become more adaptive, more focused, and more emotionally balanced. Visual anchoring, also known as gaze training or focused visual attention, is another underrated but biologically powerful practice. The human brain is organized around vision. More than half of your brain's real estate is directly or indirectly involved in processing visual information. That's not just a fun fact. It's a gateway to influence your state of mind. When you focus your gaze on a single point and hold it there without distraction, you are activating the frontal eye fields and the dorsal attention network. These areas are responsible for top-down attention, meaning you are training your brain to resist internal and external distractions. You're building the mental muscle of focus. And just as with physical exercise, it only takes a few minutes of daily practice to create neural adaptations. Over time, this translates into better task engagement, improved reading comprehension, stronger memory encoding, and reduced mental fatigue. Journaling, when done correctly, engages both reflection and planning systems in the brain. It requires you to translate experience into language, a process that activates the medial prefrontal cortex and engages the default mode network. When you write about your experiences, what went well, what was hard, what you'll do better, you're consolidating learning and setting behavioral intentions. This isn't just psychological, it's neurochemical. Reflective journaling can reduce amygdala reactivity by creating a sense of control and narrative coherence. It improves working memory, reduces rumination, and enhances cognitive flexibility. When repeated daily, it becomes a behavioral mirror that helps you track patterns, break loops, and make more conscious decisions. It's a way of offloading cognitive load so your brain can operate more efficiently. Stillness, even for a minute, has measurable effects on the nervous system. In a culture of overstimulation, deliberate stillness becomes an active neurological intervention. It allows the parasympathetic nervous system to come online and counterbalance the sympathetic, or stress response. The brain switches from task-oriented beta waves to more relaxed alpha and even theta wave states. These patterns are associated with creative problem solving, deep insight, and emotional regulation. Just 60 seconds of silence can recalibrate your system, lowering heart rate, reducing cortisol, and improving vagal tone. Repeated over time, these moments of stillness build a buffer between stimulus and response. They give you more control over your reactions, which improves decision-making, communication, and resilience under pressure. All of these tools, sunlight, cold movement, visual anchoring, journaling, stillness are supported by neuroscience and physiology. They engage different systems, but they share one thing in common. They shift your biology in a direction that supports your goals. The mistake most people make is trying to use mindset alone, but mindset is downstream of biology. If your dopamine is low, your sleep is misaligned, your focus circuits are weak, and your stress system is overloaded, no amount of motivation will override that. But if you leverage tools that are biologically grounded, you create the conditions for mindset to take root. You give your brain and body the chemistry and structure they need to support lasting change. When used consistently, these tools make effort feel easier, motivation more stable, and growth more automatic. The idea that habits operate in isolation is misleading. In the human brain and body, systems are interconnected. One function reinforces or inhibits another. This is especially true for the neural circuits and physiological processes that drive behavior. When you implement one habit and do it consistently, it doesn't just live in a vacuum. It creates a ripple effect. It alters your chemistry, shifts your mindset, and raises the baseline of your functioning. That shift doesn't stop at the border of that one habit. It spills into other systems, creating what's called a compounding feedback loop. This is the real engine of transformation. It's not about adding more effort. It's about initiating one change that improves your capacity for the next. For example, when you get early morning sunlight, you're not just aligning your circadian clock. You're also improving sleep quality for the following night. Better sleep leads to better hormone regulation, improved insulin sensitivity, enhanced mood, and better cognitive control. Those physiological upgrades make it easier to choose healthy foods, focus at work, exercise regularly, and regulate emotions. So a seemingly small behavior, 2 to 10 minutes of morning light, ends up influencing multiple domains: cognitive performance, emotional balance, energy levels, and self-control. That's a feedback loop. One action reinforces the capacity for others. When you start stacking habits like this, the brain begins to encode them as linked experiences. This happens through a process called synaptic tagging. When multiple neural pathways are activated close in time, the brain starts to associate them. So if you expose yourself to cold therapy and then follow that with a few minutes of journaling, those behaviors begin to link. The surge of dopamine and norepinephrine from cold exposure makes your brain more alert, and that heightened state carries into the journaling process. Your reflections feel sharper. Your planning becomes more structured. You're not just getting better at two tasks, you're creating a synergy between them. The brain builds circuits around routines, not individual behaviors, and the more consistent the pairing, the stronger the linkage. This is also why time of day matters. The human body runs on ultradian and circadian rhythms, natural cycles of alertness, hormone release, and cognitive capacity. When you anchor habits to consistent times, they become easier to repeat. Not because of discipline, but because of biological readiness. For instance, if you move your body in the morning, 10 to 20 minutes of walking, stretching, or aerobic exercise, you amplify the rise in cortisol and core body temperature that naturally occurs in the early part of the day. That biological amplification increases energy, sharpens attention, and shifts your motivational state. That elevated state then makes it more likely that you'll follow through with other mentally demanding habits like focused work or visual attention training. The behaviors stack on top of one another because they're aligned with underlying biology. That stacking becomes a behavioral loop that sustains itself without requiring constant willpower. Dopamine plays a central role in this process. It's often misunderstood as a molecule of pleasure, but it's more accurately the molecule of motivation, effort, and reinforcement. Each time you complete a habit, no matter how small, and consciously register it as a win, you get a small bump in dopamine. That bump makes you more likely to repeat the behavior. Over time, this process builds momentum. Momentum is not a feeling, it's a neurochemical state. When you have a consistent source of dopamine driven by effort and achievement, your baseline level of drive increases. And that increase in drive isn't specific to one habit. It generalizes. You start to feel more capable. You start to seek out challenge. That's when the compound effect really kicks in. Success breeds success because of how dopamine teaches the brain what to value. This compounding mechanism doesn't require dramatic inputs, it just requires consistency and awareness. If you start your day with stillness, just 60 seconds of calm, focused breathing, you lower your sympathetic tone and shift into a state of parasympathetic readiness. That state increases vagal tone, improves emotional regulation, and enhances executive function. You become more capable of navigating your morning without reactivity. That calmness makes it easier to focus, to resist impulsive choices, and to engage more deeply with others. The benefit is not just in the stillness, it's in what the stillness enables, and over time, the effects multiply. The feedback loops can also work in reverse. Poor sleep leads to lower mood, increased stress reactivity, and impaired decision making. That makes it harder to stick to healthy habits. Skipping movement decreases BDNF, which affects learning and mood, which decreases motivation to move. So it's not just about adding positive loops, it's also about preventing negative ones. When you're aware of the compounding nature of habits, you become more protective of the foundational ones. You recognize that skipping a habit isn't a single failure. It's a potential breach in a system that supports multiple domains of your life. That awareness adds gravity to even the simplest behaviors. As these feedback loops grow, they begin to shape your identity, not through affirmations, but through evidence. The brain is constantly tracking your actions and forming predictions about who you are and what you're capable of. When your behavior consistently reflects effort, reflection, focus, and growth, even in small doses, the prediction changes. You're no longer someone trying to change, you're someone who changes. The loops reinforce that identity because they are based on action, not intention. And action is the language the brain listens to. One of the most powerful things you can do is choose one small habit and repeat it daily with intention. Then add another that naturally fits before or after it. Create a rhythm, build a loop. As these loops stack and stabilize, they stop being things you do. They become structures that carry you. The habits create conditions for your biology to thrive. Your biology amplifies your behavior. And your behavior reshapes your identity. That is the compounding effect. That is the loop of transformation. When most people think about change, they imagine a surge of motivation, a burst of inspiration that drives them to overhaul their routines, shift their mindset, or finally break bad habits. But neuroscience doesn't support this model. Motivation is transient. It's influenced by variables like sleep, blood glucose, emotional state, dopamine tone, and stress hormones. If you rely on motivation, you're tying your ability to act to a constantly shifting internal landscape. That's unstable. What the brain and body respond to far more consistently is structure. When behavior is organized into repeatable, timed actions, whether you feel like doing them or not, you activate a different system, the one that governs discipline, habit formation, and automaticity. In the brain, repeated actions encoded in consistent time blocks begin to move from goal-directed behavior to habitual behavior. This is a transition from the prefrontal cortex, where decisions are made consciously, to the basal ganglia, where routines are stored and triggered automatically. When you first adopt a habit, your brain requires effort to assess the context, predict outcomes, and initiate action. But as you repeat the habit at the same time of day, under similar conditions, your brain recognizes a pattern. That pattern allows the action to be triggered without deliberation. This shift saves cognitive energy. Your brain is a prediction machine, and it loves regularity. The more structure you build into your routines, the less resistance you experience. This is especially important in the first few weeks of building a new habit. The 21-day time frame isn't magic, but it reflects a rough biological truth. That's the minimum duration required to start reshaping synaptic pathways and move a behavior from effortful to semi-automatic. In the early days, you may need to use intention, attention, and even friction, reducing tools to get started, but the key is that you don't wait to feel inspired. You build a protocol. For example, if you decide to journal each night before bed, you don't wait to feel reflective. You tie the behavior to a structural anchor, like brushing your teeth. You place your journal on the pillow in the morning, so it's there waiting for you at night. You remove decision making. You remove choice. That's structure. The brain releases dopamine in anticipation of a reward. When you complete a habit, and especially when you recognize the completion of that habit, you reinforce the neural loop that will make future completion easier. This is called reward prediction error minimization. When a behavior is predicted, performed, and rewarded, even with something as simple as a mental check mark, it tightens the loop. If the reward is inconsistent or the behavior is irregular, the loop weakens. That's why structure is more reliable than motivation. It creates predictable behavior, reward circuits that reinforce themselves, and once these circuits are strong enough, they no longer require conscious input. You don't think about brushing your teeth, you just do it. The same is possible for habits that once felt difficult: movement, journaling, breathwork, focus practice, sunlight exposure, cold showers. Once they are wired into your routine. Another powerful feature of structure is that it reduces decision fatigue. Every time you decide whether or not to do something, you spend willpower. Willpower is a depletable resource, tied to the function of the anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These regions are sensitive to glucose, stress, and fatigue. If you spend all day making choices, what to eat, when to move, whether to check your phone, you wear down these systems. But if your habits are pre-decided and structured, you preserve cognitive energy. You're no longer deciding to act. You're simply following a protocol, and the brain likes protocols. It evolved to follow rhythms and rituals. Our ancestors didn't ask themselves every morning whether to build a fire or forage for food. They followed structured cycles, often tied to daylight and seasonal cues. Modern life is chaotic, but your biology hasn't changed. It still craves predictable rhythms. Structure also supports identity change. Each time you follow through on a structured habit, especially when you don't feel like it, you provide evidence to your brain about who you are. Identity in neuroscience is not a fixed trait. It's a pattern of predictions your brain makes based on past behavior. When your structure leads to consistent execution, your brain begins to update those predictions. It says, this is someone who follows through. This is someone who moves every morning. This is someone who focuses. This is someone who reflects. Those identity shifts, repeated over days and weeks, alter your self-image. That self-image becomes the lens through which you approach future decisions. You begin to behave in alignment with who you believe you are. It's important to remember that structure is flexible, not rigid. Rigidity breaks under stress, but a well-designed structure adapts without collapsing. If you miss a habit one day, the structure doesn't fall apart. It absorbs the miss and continues. That's the difference between perfectionism and protocol. Perfectionism says, if I miss one day, I've failed. Structure says, this is a long-term system. One skip doesn't undo the circuit. The brain is more responsive to average behavior over time than it is to isolated peaks or valleys. So when you return to the habit the next day, the structure remains intact. That consistency over time is what reshapes the nervous system. Another biological advantage of structure is that it trains your stress response. When habits are built into your day, they become stress regulators. Movement lowers cortisol. Stillness increases heart rate variability. Sunlight aligns melatonin. Journaling offloads cognitive overload. Each structured habit is a lever you can pull to keep your system in balance. Without structure, stress becomes reactive. You're constantly responding to problems. With structure, stress becomes managed. You're proactively buffering your system. That changes your entire relationship with challenge. Instead of being destabilized by pressure, you become conditioned to handle it. Eventually, the structure becomes the scaffolding for everything else you want to build. It frees your mind, sharpens your focus, stabilizes your mood, and increases your adaptability. You stop relying on how you feel in any given moment and start relying on the systems you've built. That's not a loss of freedom. It's the foundation of freedom. Because when your biology and behavior are aligned through structure, you become free to create, to perform, and to grow without burning out.